U.S. President Donald Trump has announced that Israel and Hamas have both signed off on the first phase of a Gaza peace plan. Trump said the two sides had reached a deal on a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of Israeli hostages under his plan for ending the two-year-old war in the Palestinian enclave. He made the announcement on his Truth Social platform. The U.S. president says Washington will do everything possible to ensure all sides comply with any deal. His envoy, Steve Witkoff, and son-in-law Jared Kushner are in Egypt for the talks, and Trump said earlier he may travel there on Saturday. We can now turn to our Washington correspondent, Janelle Dumalaon. So, Janelle, Trump has announced a deal has been reached on social media. What exactly did the U.S. president have to say?
Yeah, Aaron, so this was obviously a very momentous announcement. He made that in that Truth Social post. And in that post, there were many points that were addressed. Chief of them, as you mentioned, is that Israel and Hamas have signed off on what he called a first phase of this peace plan to end the war in Gaza. Now, if you remember, there was this 20-point plan that was released last week when Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came to the White House. This, of course, is the plan that he is referring to in the post. Now, the post also says that all remaining hostages will be released. We're talking about 20 remaining hostages who are thought to still be alive in Gaza, as well as around 25 whose remains will have to be returned to their loved ones. Now, there is this other part of the deal. These hostages are also supposed to be released in exchange for the release of 250 Palestinian prisoners, as well as 1,700 Gazans jailed during the course of the war, but we are less clear on when that part of the exchange is happening. Another point that was mentioned in the post was that the Israeli troops will withdraw to an agreed upon line. Now, of course, as I am saying, this is a very, very relevant announcement. Those families have been waiting for hostages to come home for 2 years. But of course, this is just the beginning of a very complicated process. That Truth Social post, of course, did not mention whether Hamas is agreeing to disarm, whether Hamas is agreeing to surrender any role in the future governance of Gaza. But even if this is the beginning, it is a very welcome development if those hostages are indeed released and if the bombardment on Gaza is stopped. Of course, that the bombardment would have to stop in order for those hostages to be released safely. As such, the news has been welcomed in Israel and Gaza, as we have been hearing.
Well, as you were saying there were still a lot of details to be hammered out. What exactly are the next steps from the U.S. perspective?
Well, Netanyahu said that he would be convening his government on Thursday in order to sign off on the agreement with Hamas, but that is something that is expected to happen. As you mentioned earlier, Donald Trump said that he will be traveling to the Middle East this weekend. We don't know exactly when and exactly where. He said that he would likely go on Saturday, perhaps, to Egypt, although interestingly enough, he also did not rule out going to Gaza when he was asked about it. The expectation is also forming that the hostages will be released as early as this weekend. But of course, more long term, we also mentioned that 20-point plan earlier. That is a very long list of things to get done, among them also the setting up of a transitional authority towards future governance of Gaza. So there is a long way to go. Talks will have to continue, and pressure will have to be put on all actors in order to achieve what is basically the aim here. And it is a very, very complex project, ending that 2-year war, as well as achieving a lasting peace.
All right, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. That was U.S. Correspondent Janelle Dumalaon in Washington. Thank you very much for your reporting. For its part, Hamas released a statement to the press where it confirmed it had reached a deal to end the war. That statement reads, after responsible and strenuous negotiations between Hamas and the Palestinian resistance fractions regarding President Trump's proposal in Sharm el-Sheikh, with the goal of reaching an end to the genocide against Palestinian people and the occupation's withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, the Islamic resistance movement, also known as Hamas, announces it has reached an agreement stipulating an end to the war in Gaza, the occupation's withdrawal from it, and the entry of aid and a prisoner exchange. We can now cross over to Giorgio Cafiero. He's the CEO and founder of Gulf State Analytics, a geopolitical risk consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. So, Giorgio, Israel and Hamas have signed off on a phase one of a Gaza peace plan. What was your first reaction when you heard the news?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on tonight. Obviously, as your program has pointed out, this is simply phase one, meaning that there's other phases to go, and there are many complex issues to work through. But when I heard the news that the sides agreed to phase one, this was certainly a sign that the process is moving ahead and that the efforts on the part of the Trump administration, as well as some of the regional states, chiefly Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey, all of their efforts have been productive. And it seems that the pressure that different global and regional players have put on both Hamas and Israel has been working. Whether the sides will get to the second and third and other phases remains to be seen. But this is definitely a positive indication that things are moving in the right direction from the standpoint of those who are in favor of Trump's initiative.
Now, I'd like to stay with that point for just a second, if I could. Hamas has urged the U.S. to make sure Israel will adhere to the ceasefire. Now, after 2 years of war, is there enough trust on both sides to propel this deal to a more permanent end of the fighting?
This is a really, really important question you're asking. In my opinion, the biggest source of concern is the fact that there are really no mechanisms to guarantee that there will be Israeli compliance. What is going to happen if all of the Israelis who have been held captive in Gaza are freed, they return home, and then Israel resumes its hostilities and aggression against Gaza? What will happen at that point? It's very unclear. I think, obviously, this is why the issue of Hamas disarming is a real sticking point. Hamas and other Palestinian factions in Gaza are very worried about what would happen if the group would disarm and then Israel would resume its war on Gaza. There is obviously really no trust between the different sides. Hamas and just the Palestinian people in general have absolutely no reason to consider the United States some sort of honest broker. We also saw what happened after Hezbollah and Israel entered into a ceasefire 11 months ago. And also we saw what happened when the United States and Iran were engaged in nuclear talks earlier this year. Actors in the region do not believe that the American-Israeli alliance necessarily negotiates with their adversaries in good faith. So there's really not a lot of trust. But this is where countries such as Qatar, Turkey, and Egypt, I think, have really important roles to play in terms of serving as diplomatic bridges between the different sides.
Now, if I'm understanding you correctly, you are also quite reticent about the long-term prospects of this deal. So do you think both sides are actually interested in a lasting peace, or could this be some type of delaying tactic before we see future fighting?
It's a great question. I think that there are obviously aims that the Netanyahu government has in terms of its greater Israel agenda, and I don't think that those aims are going to simply go away just because of this development, this diplomatic breakthrough that took place just now in Egypt. I am worried that this might just sort of be a moment in which the hostilities are paused. We also, of course, saw what happened with the ceasefire that went into effect in January but collapsed in March. I don't think anyone in Gaza forgot how that happened. So to be sure, this is good news that the hostilities will at least pause. Very, very good to see prisoners, hostages returned home and to see humanitarian aid coming into Gaza. Don't get me wrong. This is very, very positive. but what's going to happen later as the next phases are being negotiated. So many unknown variables, a lot can go sideways.
Now, as we move along this 20-point plan, where do you see the major sticking points as we move through phase one into phase two?
Well, I think obviously a huge sticking point has to do with post-conflict governance in Gaza. What is the role, if any, that Hamas is going to be able to play in terms of governance of the enclave? Also, when we talk about the group disarming, where are these weapons going to go to? Also, what will be the sequencing of the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza? These issues are rather complicated. It's going to probably take quite a bit of time for the parties to work through these issues. Certainly no guarantee that they're going to successfully do so. Just because phase one, we got in through phase one does not mean that the other phases will be easy. Again, this is a positive development in many ways, but the road ahead will certainly be shaped by many obstacles. And I don't think it will be impossible for the two sides to overcome them. But again, this is going to be a rather complicated process. And as you pointed out, there is a real lack of trust between the two sides. And it's really difficult to ignore the fact that this lack of trust is going to be very problematic here.
Okay, it appears we have a long road ahead of us. That was Giorgio Cafiero, CEO and founder of Gulf State Analytics. Thank you very much for your analysis.
Thank you.
And just moments after U.S. President Trump announced the Gaza ceasefire deal on Truth Social, I spoke to Aaron David Miller, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace think tank. I asked him what the next steps could be.
In 48 hours, perhaps longer, depending on how long it takes Hamas to gather the remains of those hostages that are longer living, the Israeli deployment to a redeployment to a line within Gaza. This is going to be a complicated prison release. It'll have to involve a cessation of hostilities in order to have it take place. And then there's the return of 250 Palestinians accused of killing Israelis and 1,700, release of 1,700 Palestinians that the Israelis picked up after October 7th. It's still a lot of complexity, but it seems that Hamas, key Arab states, Washington, and Israel are now committed to at least the first phase of this 20-point plan's implementation.
Now, we have seen in the past various deals come together and fall apart over the course of this conflict. Do you think that both sides are at a point where they're willing to actually get this across the finishing line, or could we be seeing some delaying tactics like we have seen during negotiations in years past?
There are only two ceasefires, one in November of 2023 and one in January. Both were implemented more or less according to the terms that Israel and Hamas agreed to. I suspect that the first phase of this, as I mentioned, will also come to fruition within the next several days. Beyond that, it's impossible to predict right now whether or not an agreement can be reached between two parties, Hamas on one hand, according to an American statute and law, U.S. statute and law, a terror organization, and the state of Israel. That's unclear to me. But right now, let's focus on getting through this first phase, which I think will probably, more likely than not, be implemented.
That was Aaron David Miller, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace think tank.